Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum, and I hope that you are all having a wonderful week, a wonderful Wednesday. Today is July 1st, episode 169, so congratulations. You have made it through yet another month of 2020. I'm so proud of you. It has been a difficult year, but we're halfway done, so go bake yourself a cake, make yourself a drink. You deserve it. But for today's episode, I'm very excited because I get to talk about one of my favorite things in the film industry, and that just so happens to be animation. This entire episode, save for the last segment, I'll explain that in just a sec, but the entire episode is going to be animated films. So the first film that I'm reviewing today is called A Whisker Away. It's a brand new Netflix original film. The second film that I'm reviewing is Fantastic Mr. Fox, streaming right now on Disney+, a Wes Anderson film. And finally, my recommendation for the day is Kubo and the Two Strings, a stop-motion animation. And then for my final segment, I figured that since it's the first day of the month, we're halfway through the year, that I would look forward to the rest of the year. So I'm going to be talking about the film industry at large. What are some of the biggest movie announcements, biggest movie news, what we can expect going forward as far as theaters, some of the newest releases. And yeah, that's basically it. I want to just give a movie debrief, basically, talk about the industry, because that's always helpful and I think beneficial for context in the films that we watch. I think that's always a fun thing to do. So that's the episode, and I'm going to get right into it. Alright, so the first film today is called A Whisker Away. It is a new Netflix original anime film, straight out of Japan, so it is subtitled, which I found very fun to watch. It's directed by Junichi Sato and Tomotaka Shibiyama. It stars Mirai Shida and Natsuki Hanae. It follows Mio, who is an eccentric middle school student. At a local festival, she meets a mask seller who gives her a cat mask that gives her the ability to turn into a cat whenever she dons it. She's also head over heels for one of her classmates, Hinode, who doesn't pay her much mind at school, doesn't pay her any attention, so she dons the cat mask after school and visits him every day after school as a stray cat who he takes care of. So full disclosure, I want to be upfront, give you the context of how I watched this film whenever I do these reviews, just so everybody is clear. I fully intended to watch Scoob today, but so I planned this entire episode as an animated episode. That's always what the intention was, and when I went to go look for Scoob, because I hadn't seen it, I wanted to catch up. There's still a lot of catching up I have to do for a lot of the COVID-19 streaming digital release movies. It was $20 that I did not have at the time, so I decided to try and find a different animated movie. So I looked it up, looked on all of the streaming services, and came across this, A Whisker Away, which I had never even heard of, didn't know that it was coming out, didn't know anything about it, which I always find very, very fun, that I had zero context, didn't know the plot, didn't look up the plot, and I was very happy. I'm very, very happy with this movie. I thought it was very good. It was very cute. It is subtitled, just so everybody knows. So I'm kind of going to talk about, in the beginning of this review, sort of the cultural context as much as I can become aware of, because there is a lot of things that I feel as though are lost in translation, literally, when talking about and watching movies from other countries. I think we take for granted a lot of times, at least we as in Americans. So from a personal perspective, but if you are listening to this from America, I think we take for granted a lot of times that the cultural context of the movies that we watch are all from the United States, so we kind of already know what's going on, even if it's not explained in the plot of the movie. So there are a lot of things that are displayed in foreign films that we might not know and might be taken for granted for the creators and viewers there. So in particular for this one, there's a lot of aspects of theater and folklore that I don't know how much of it is relevant nowadays to Japanese people, how much of it is in common vernacular, zeitgeist, that kind of thing. So it follows a mask seller in part who seems to be kind of a sly demon type character, definitely kind of a trickster. Think sort of the snake type archetype in American culture, or at least Western type cultures. And in any film about animals from different countries, we don't know necessarily the context of what that animal represents in that country necessarily, and so this one is all about cats. I did do a little bit of research as much as I could. So in Japanese culture, there is a character called the Bakeneko, who is a changed cat, basically a cat that can kind of shapeshift and is more of a trickster demon type character. So that seemed to be the most relevant to this film, as most of the plot centers around characters that can shapeshift, in particular characters that can shapeshift into cats, which I found very fascinating. The masks come from No theater, which is one of the oldest, still currently performed types of theater. It's a dance style theater in particular, where lots of masks are used, and so that seemed to be an inspiration for the film, which I found very fascinating. As far as watching it in subtitles and things like that, I always am a little bit skeptical to review the dialogue screenplay, because in most foreign films, particularly films from Asia, there doesn't seem to be a lot of subtlety in the dialogue, and I think that just comes from, I just think that is literally lost in translation. So it's a lot of the translations, I think, become a lot more simplistic, a lot more dulled down for American audiences, because some of the nuances in the language that are words that we might not even necessarily have, or things that we don't necessarily know what they mean as far as in terms of like that culture goes. So I try not to review the dialogue because it always seems a little bit more simplistic, and I don't think that is necessarily the case all the time. I mean, you can even look at the title of the film, which in America is A Whisker Away, but supposedly, if it's translated literally, it's called Wanting to Cry, I Pretend to Be a Cat, which is a phenomenal title, mind you. And even that is probably a little bit lost in translation. So I do love watching films with subtitles. I would recommend that people watch with subtitles. I know it's a little bit much to be like, all right, I'm watching a movie, I'm escaping, but I also got to read. I find it fun because I feel as though I'm a lot less distracted when I'm watching films subtitled, because usually when I'm watching a film, my mind can wander like anything else, but if my mind is solely focused on reading the subtitles so I can understand what's going on, I actually feel like I'm a lot more attentive to the movie, which is really nice. So I do recommend doing that. I also think that there's a level of hearing words spoken in their language and how certain actors will use inflection in particular. It's usually different for different countries as far as what is the style to go for. So hearing the inflections and what those words mean in that language, I think also helps the understanding of the film in a little bit more of a nuanced way. So that's always really nice. So yeah, I'm not very familiar with anime films. I am not a big anime fan. I didn't really grow up with Studio Ghibli or any sort of anime television shows when I was younger, so it's not necessarily an art style or narrative style that I latched onto. I have tried to watch more in recent years because they've gained popularity with certain movies. Your Name being a pretty big example in the States. I have noticed that there are certain tropes in anime films, at least the ones that I have watched. I have particularly watched a lot of drama romance movies, so maybe this is just a staple of that part of the genre. But I have noticed a level of melodrama in a lot of these films, which I think is really fun. I think it's an added element to the film that I do really enjoy, knowing that going in. I think there is also one thing I noticed with this film in particular as well is a lot of the score tends to be acoustic as opposed to symphonic. So a lot of scores in the United States is a lot more of a symphony, orchestral type score sound to the movie, particularly blockbuster films. And in anime films, Japanese films that I've seen, a lot of them are acoustic, so piano-based, guitar-based, even sometimes there'll be a softer pop song in the film, which I think is really fun. That adds to the level of melodrama, so things feel very, very dramatic, very, very intense. And in this film in particular, it very, very much enhances it. I think it works fantastic here because the entire film is about teenagers and teen angst, which seeps through. This film is steeped in teen angst, and the use of the score and the use of the intense voice acting and the dramatic elements of the story enhance all of the character relationships going on, which I think is very, very cool, because the character relationships seem to be the most important aspect of this film. So on the surface, the movie is about magic and folklore and love, but I do really think that the film doesn't actually tell you what the bigger themes that are going on are. There are moments where characters will say what they're feeling, and I do chalk that up a lot to the intricacies of the script that we might not be getting given the translations. But while the film is primarily a movie about the relationship and romantic relationship in particular about with Hinode and Mio, I do think that the film at large is more about the relationships that we have with everyone in our lives and the miscommunications we might have, the insecurities we might have of not being able to say what we mean. So Mio has a relationship with her stepmother and her father that is very specific and intricate. Mio has one with his mother and his grandfather. They all have with each other as students. And I do think there is a level of teenagehood that involves pettiness and not wanting to say what you mean and interpreting things that should not be interpreted at all. So I think that really adds to the story, creates for some very, very good comedy, some very, very fun, lighthearted moments, but also some very emotional moments, some impactful moments, particularly towards the middle of the film. I found myself so the film is an hour and 45 minutes, and the first 45 minutes I was like, cool, we're at the climax. And we were basically just 1/3 of the way through the movie. So the film does have a very distinct structure. It's split into 3 acts, and each of those acts have a very clear plot line, and each one is sort of capped off. You can either say, I would say probably the beginning of each act. So the first minute of the film, kind of the 45-minute mark, and then maybe the hour 10 mark, basically, hour 10, hour 20 mark, have some very clear twists. And I hesitate to use the word twist because that's always like, I don't know, it's a specific thing that's used in film a lot to divert expectations, but it's just a very clear, distinct narrative choice that's being used in those parts that I found very, very fascinating and pretty unexpected, ultimately, particularly the one at the end of Act 2, beginning of Act 3. So the structure is great, and it creates a very wonderful mystery. The film is kind of all a mystery, and that also lends itself to the blend of genres that I found very apparent in the film. There is comedy, there is drama, there is an kind of an action-esque scene, definitely a chase scene, and then the whole film is kind of a mystery. So it blends genres really well. It also blends plots really well. So there's a lot of plot lines going on, but all of the plot lines are very balanced. There's a lot of characters. Pretty much, you only really need to keep track of Mio and Hinode to understand what's going on, and then the masked seller is kind of the antagonist of the film. But there is also friends of Mio, the mother and the grandfather of Hinode, and the stepmother and father of Mio There are teachers and students, bullies. So there's a lot going on, and Hinode has a sister as well. And they all have pretty distinct plots going on that are balanced really well. Obviously, Mio and Hinode get the most amount of time given to them, which is very important. The entire film is centric around them. But there are some very distinct character moments for everybody else that I think is balanced very, very well. With the fact that most of the characters are teens, like I said, it is very much steeped in teen angst. But I think that makes way for a lot of the larger themes that are being shown. So movies about insecurity and being yourself, which tends to be a lot of the films that I'm reviewing, a pretty good message. It's really about honesty and communication, and all of these nuanced relationships that you might have, and how those relationships can change, and why they maybe should change for the better, and taking accountability in yourself for those relationships just as much as the other participants in that relationship. So I found that to be very, very interesting. A lot of the character dialogue is pretty simplistic, but again, I think that is because of the subtitles and the translation. It's pretty goofy of a movie, too. It's very over the top, very kind of kabuki inspired, which is another type of Japanese theater that relies on masks and movement and little dialogue to be very expressive. And a lot of films, even in the United States, I think are inspired by that type of theater. And so this one is pretty goofy, pretty over the top, particularly with magic. But because of the fact that it's about animals and magic, I do think that works really well. Some parts for me might have been a little bit too melodramatic, but I think if you know that going in and understand the cultural context behind it, it adds to the film. So there might be a few moments that I was like, oh, okay, maybe shouldn't have done that there. Maybe a little bit silly, but I do think overall it worked very well. There was some really great physical comedy, which I liked in the visuals. A lot of the characters are very clumsy and sloppy in ways that don't feel forced, and they feel very natural for humans to be doing. It's just sort of like that's how people are. They'll hit their head on things, which I thought was very cool. And talking about the visuals of the film, all of these 3 reviews are going to incorporate animation into it, because clearly that's something that has got to be said when talking about animation. So the animation in this is gorgeous. Obviously, a lot of anime films are, but I think there was a pretty distinct style to me for this film, because anime films tend to be, at least to me, somebody who doesn't watch the genre that much, I think this is definitely an overgeneralization, is sort of the same. Like, the art style is obviously very similar intentionally, but the complexities of the drawing and even just sort of the flatness of the lines or sharpness of the lines seem to be very similar. But this one felt very distinct. All of the characters are drawn very simplistically. They're not very complex, which seems to be very different from a lot of anime films. They're almost flat, but that isn't a bad thing. I think it works really well here. They're very distinct. They're soft and simplistic. The CGI composites of the background, so that's a pretty common tactic that's used in animated films now, is to make the backgrounds be computer generated as opposed to hand drawn on the computer. And so that has been going on ever since the 90s, and sometimes it can feel out of place because the characters are more hand drawn and the backgrounds are CGI composites, and that's usually done because it's faster, it's easier, and it looks just as good, if not better. But sometimes the art styles clash, and I think that in this one in particular, the distinctness of the characters versus the backgrounds, and how simplistic the characters are and how complex the backgrounds are, or even photorealistic the backgrounds are, I actually think it blends really nicely, and that's usually because of the natural environment that's used with greenery and leaves and water and rain, and so all of it flows very nicely for me. The framing is very intentional and very creative. There were some really creative shots that I was not expecting. The use of split screen every now and then, montage. There are some beautiful shots just in general with how characters are placed in the scene. The colors pop very, very well. if anything with the framing, I think sometimes the geography of scenes is not very well established. So the geography of the town doesn't need to be established because there's distinct locations of kind of two houses and a school, but there is a scene particularly in the end of the film. There's a more natural landscape with a chase scene that I don't think the geography is kind of explained or shown as well as it could be. But that's a very small gripe ultimately, because I did really like this film. I thought it was very cute. I came out smiling. Make sure you watch through the credits because there's a little epilogue in the credits that I really enjoyed. The music is wonderful. The voice acting is very intense and very, very fun to listen to. So I would highly recommend this movie. I think it is good for the entire family. I think it is fun. It is exciting. It is adorable. It is a great love story. And it captures teenagehood and middle school, high school age very, very well. So I'm going to give this film a soft to solid 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really fun watch. And so I can recommend this film to you guys. So I hope that you check it out. It's brand new, streaming on Netflix for free right now. So that's A Whisker Away. Stay tuned for the rest of the episode where I talk about Fantastic Mr. Fox, Kubo and the Two Strings, and the rest of the film industry. But for right now, we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review of A Whisker Away. I am now going to give a review on Fantastic Mr. Fox, and then I'll be giving my review of Kubo and the Two Strings. And make sure you stay tuned until the very end of the episode where I talk about the movie industry at large. So Fantastic Mr. Fox is streaming right now on Disney+. It is a film directed by Wes Anderson, starring George Clooney, Meryl Streep, and Jason Schwartzman. Based on the Roald Dahl book, it follows Mr. Fox, who is living a happy life with his family, but cannot resist the allure of his raiding and burglary days, but has to protect his family and the local animal community when the farmers that he steals from fight back. So I was very excited to watch this film. It came out in 2009. This is not a rewatch for me. I had never seen it before, so this is my weekly watch. But it was streaming on Disney+, so it was free, which was nice, and I wouldn't call myself a big Wes Anderson fan. I am definitely a Wes Anderson fan, but I am a bigger stop-motion fan, and I was a very big fan of his film Isle of Dogs from a couple years ago, which was also a stop-motion animated film. So I was excited to watch this, and I do think that my expectations played into this because I didn't like it as much as I wanted to. This is a lot of people's favorite animated film. It is a very different, unique animated film from a lot of the animated movies coming out currently and coming out back in 2009, 2010. So my personal opinion is that it wasn't necessarily my favorite, and I will explain why, but I will also explain some of the good things from this film. So we'll start with the animation in particular. The animation is gorgeous. I'm going to be saying that for all three of the movies this week, but the animation in this film, stop motion, I love. I think it's a little bit of a lost art form because it is so time intensive and so intricate, and the amount that you can do on a computer nowadays is miraculous. And so a lot of stop motion has kind of has been lost in the mainstream. And so I'm very happy that it was stop motion animated, and the type of animation that is used here really plays into the characters with the slyness of their movements and the specificity of all of the characters' faces and body movements I thought was very fascinating to see and definitely lended itself to the story. Wes Anderson obviously has a very specific style. His name is synonymous with symmetry and colors and the specifics of his framing. But his style is very well suited for animation. In fact, I would probably say it's perfectly suited for animation because animation intentionally draws attention to itself because of the fact that the medium is different than we might be seeing in real life. And that is a style that Wes Anderson chooses to implement as well. All of his films draw attention to the style very specifically. And I think that is a very fascinating way to tell a movie. And so Wes Anderson does that very well. All of his films are based in reality, but definitely have whimsical elements that the style, I think, lends itself to. So animation in particular, Wes Anderson, ever since Fantastic Mr. Fox, has been implementing into all of his films with 3D models and moments of kind of action. I'm thinking of Grand Budapest Hotel in particular has a lot of moments like that. But animation is a very wonderful tool for filmmakers to use, and I think Wes Anderson is somebody who uses it very, very well, particularly stop motion, which I really like. And like I said, I think the style serves the substance very well. So I talked last week about how there's usually a little bit of a battle between style and substance, that they are either mutually exclusive or one is better than the other. I think that Wes Anderson is a prime example of how to use them well together, so that his style is so specific and so unique that you can't help but notice it. And so the substance of the movie also plays into that as well. A lot of his films have very adult themes, but themes that are very well spelled out and pretty clearly stated throughout the actions of the film. So obviously they're not said necessarily by any of the characters, but common rule of storytelling, show don't tell, is something that Wes Anderson uses pretty darn well. And so his style is something that feels like it's out of a storybook sometimes. And so the themes in all of his films also are kind of like that, where they are specific and spelled out and clear, which is very much like a fable or a storybook, which is also a common theme for the day. All of the movies that I've talked about and will be talking about are rooted in fable, folklore type things, and I think that's something that Wes Anderson intentionally does. So in this film, there's a lot of adult themes that are not sugar-coated, but wrapped in this childlike wonder. And so it's a film that was primarily marketed towards kids, but there's a common debate as to whether it is even really a kids movie and can be treated as such. And I would probably argue more towards that it's almost more of an adult movie than a kids movie, but that's just me. So a lot of the heart and deeper themes of the film have to deal with addiction and inadequacy and independence. Something that is shown throughout the film with Mr. Fox as far as the independence that he needs to have from his family, which kind of manifests itself in his addiction towards stealing and burglary. And so his son also exemplifies that in the fact that he feels inadequate and needs to assert his independence so that he can feel more accepted and adequate and happy with himself. So a lot of these moments are pretty serious, and the film is super silly from the get-go, and so a lot of these serious, sadder moments, I think, come out of nowhere, are very abrupt. They might be hinted at for a lot of the film as far as the character motivations go, but the actual moments in which they happen are pretty out of the blue, pretty abrupt, which very well could have been intentional. These things are jarring to talk about, and so making them jarring for the viewer, I think, is very effective, but it didn't work in a narrative sense for me. I think in a moral, thematic sense, it is a very effective tool to be using to throw it in the face of the viewer almost randomly. It's just not something that I vibed with necessarily. As far as the characters go, I had initially thought in watching the movie that the characters weren't very well fleshed out, weren't very well delved into. But upon closer examination, they are actually very distinct characters. They are just not very likable. And that is something that is used in film very often as to whether a character should be likable, regardless of whether or not they're the protagonist. But I didn't find any of the characters in this film necessarily likable. They all have pretty distinct flaws that, although they reference and they talk about changing towards the end of the film, like any good character, there isn't very much evidence of that being the case, both in moments prior to when a new normal, quote unquote, is established, or at the end of the film. So the movie itself, with the style and the story, is more charming than the characters. I'm always somebody that latches onto characters more than anything else. I think that is the most important part of a story, and so the characters here are fairly unlikable, not as interesting as they could be, and so I think the movie, with its style and story, is the most interesting, most exciting, most likable thing about the film itself, which is a good thing. So if that's something that you latch onto more than characters, I would say that you would probably like this movie better than I did. So that's just a personal opinion as far as the characters go, but I do think the movie is a little bit better than the characters are. The filmmaking itself, talking about the characters, the voice acting is excellent. With any Wes Anderson film, there is a huge slew of voice actors. So in this one, we got George Clooney, Meryl Streep, Jason Schwartzman, Bill Murray, Owen Wilson. That's just to name a very select few. Wes Anderson himself even is in this movie. So the voice acting is obviously going to be great. The filmmaking and the directing actually plays a part in that as well, because a lot of the filming for the voice acting was done outside of a studio, on site, whether it be in the environment that the character's supposed to be in or a makeshift version of that environment. So a lot of it was kind of done on the fly type thing, where it's not as rehearsed in a studio, but it's more on par with live action filmmaking, which I found very unique and very original, and definitely shows in the voice acting. A lot of the voice acting is also very dry on purpose. That's a lot of the comedy that Wes Anderson likes to play into, so I think that works very well. I would have wanted to hear a lot more from Meryl Streep, actually. Having such a seasoned actress in the movie, and she doesn't play nearly as large a role as I would have liked. She definitely has a shining moment towards the middle end of the film, but I would have wanted to hear a lot more from her sooner. The script is fun. Like I said, I like the script a little bit better than I like the characters in the script. So the dialogue and the story beats, as opposed to the actual characterizations of each character. In particular, I thought the comedy works very well. It's laugh out loud funny. There is any curse word that would be used in the film, because it's a kids movie, is replaced with the word cuss, which I find hilarious. I think that is very clever. That was my favorite part of the movie. That's my outstanding moment from the movie, the use of cussing, which I think is fun. Looking at animation as cinematography is something that is somewhat disputed. It's hard to, because you're not necessarily using a camera all the time, but in stop motion in particular, you are using a camera a lot of the time. So I think the cinematography is gorgeous. There's a huge emphasis on lighting, something that makes up 70% of a shot. That's something that I learned in my cinematography class, that it's not all camera. Most of it, in fact, is about lighting. And so Wes Anderson puts a huge emphasis on that. Particularly, there are some very unique moments, scenes with darker lighting and brighter colors, vice versa. There's a scene with lightning and electricity that I find very fascinating from a filmmaking standpoint. So the shots, obviously, because of the lighting, are beautiful. There's a scene by a waterfall, which is probably one of the more famous scenes from the film. which is breathtaking. I honestly don't know how they made it look so good. And so those are my thoughts on Fantastic Mr. Fox. I thought I thought it was awkward, but not necessarily in the most charming sense from the characters. So it was a little bit underwhelming for me. I think part of that was because I had very high expectations, given that I'm a Wes Anderson fan, I'm a stop motion fan, and a lot of my friends liked it a lot. So if any of the things that I said stand out to you as something that you enjoy, I would say I recommend it. I would say that I recommend it in general. I think it is a movie that people have a lot of specific opinions on. Don't necessarily take my word for it. I also think that you should support animation as much as possible. And Wes Anderson is a very unique voice in the filmmaking industry. So I think Fantastic Mr. Fox is a pretty hearty recommendation, but for me, I would give it about a soft 6. So that's my review on Fantastic Mr. Fox. Next up is my review on Kubo and the Two Strings, and make sure you stay tuned until the very end where I talk about the movie industry at large and give some of the biggest movie news and announcements. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have just given my review of A Whisker Away as well as Fantastic Mr. Fox. I am now going to give my weekly recommendation of Kubo and the Two Strings. And finally, at the very end of the episode, I will run down some of the most recent movie news and movie announcements in a debrief of the movie industry at large. So right now is Kubo and the Two Strings, starring Charlize Theron and Matthew McConaughey. It follows a young boy named Kubo who has the power to bring paper to life and tell origami stories, but after the death of his father and his mother, he has to go on a magical quest with a monkey and a beetle to find his father's indestructible armor and defeat a slew of vengeful spirits, including the Moon King, the spirit that is plaguing his local village. So I love this film. I watched this film in theaters. It is produced by a studio called Laika, which is one of my favorite studios currently working. It is the only full-time major mainstream stop-motion animation studio. So this entire film was stop-motion, much like Fantastic Mr. Fox. There are a few elements of CGI incorporated throughout, but that is mostly just to enhance the stop-motion, because there is an insane amount of time and patience that it takes to make a film like this, and Laika is the prime example of it. You might know them from films like Coraline and Paranorman, or The Missing Link most recently. In this film in particular, they have puppetry that is 16 feet tall. There is a skeleton in this film that is 16 feet tall. There is also an eyeball that I think is around 10 or 11 feet, that has computer movements in the middle of the eye, so it makes it easier to move around during the scene itself. So there is a very large amount of time taken for these films, and it shows. This film had been being worked on for 5 years. It is directed by Travis Knight, who was the CEO of Laika at the time. So the absolute care that is taken for this film is honestly inspirational. You can tell a lot of the time that was taken for this film because of the influence of it. It is obviously based in Japanese folklore, much like A Whisker Away, but it is an American film directed by an American filmmaker, so there isn't as much of the cultural context that you might have missed in A Whisker Away if you're not from Japan or not Japanese. And so most of what is shown culturally is done in a more research-based way as far as I can tell. But there are still a lot of culturally significant elements in this film, origami being one of them. And what is very cool is that a lot of the animation styles take inspiration from the art styles of Japan. So all of the film is done in stop motion, and to make paper in stop motion is very difficult. You can't necessarily make origami in stop motion given the way a paper crinkles and isn't as malleable as clay or styrofoam might be. So the filmmakers actually used Tyvek, the type that you see on new houses, to make realistic looking paper that can still be malleable like a lot of the other characters in the film, which I found very, very cool. All of the art, all of the costuming takes inspiration from Japanese culture, which is completely necessary when telling a story like this, but I think that the research that the filmmakers did was very useful in enhancing the story at large. So the story itself is told like a fable, told like a Japanese fairy tale. Unlike A Whisker Away that has a much more traditional 3-act structure, most stories have a 3-act structure, so the first act being setup, second act being conflict, and third act being payoff. And so A Whisker Away follows the traditional film story, whereas this film follows a much more fable-like story where there is monsters that one must encounter, and you can still definitely adhere it to a 3-act structure, but it is much more about the journey, and that is something that is emphasized in a lot of stories like this. It rewards viewers for paying attention at the beginning of the film. That is a very significant motif. I believe it's the first line of the film. Make sure you pay attention. And every aspect of the film rewards a viewer for paying attention in a lot of the payoffs, which I found very, very nice. There are some moments in the film that could be criticized for being cliche, with a lot of the themes of love and community that might be overused or exhausted, but with the creativity of the storytelling and the weaving of characters and the relationships between these characters, and also the changing elements in potentially even appearance of these characters, makes these cliches a lot more effective. And obviously cliches happen for a reason. They are time and time again some of the most effective storytelling themes and morals, and so telling them in a more creative way with the stop motion and the Japanese style, I think, is awesome from a filmmaking standpoint. The cinematography and the animation of the film is, once again, obviously gorgeous. One of the most interesting elements of it being the framing, and so almost every shot has a pretty distinct background, whether it be the CGI background of the environment, or most specifically I'm talking about backgrounds that have creatures or other people characters. There is so much going on in the background that honestly encourages viewers to look around at what's happening, which from a film that it takes so long to animate even the main character, putting that much time and attention into background characters to make it that much more of an enjoyable experience for viewers is something that is absolutely commendable for the filmmakers. The colors of the film, I think, are also something that stands out pretty distinctly. A lot of animated films have a distinct color palette. Kubo doesn't necessarily have that distinct color palette. It's just very colorful. There are moments of darkness with the themes of the moon and the spirits that are involved with that. So there are darker, bluer scenes of the film, but it's just a much more natural aesthetic with every color in the rainbow being shown. It is a very bright, visually stunning film to look at. That also coincides with the design of the characters. Pretty much every character has a distinct color palette as well as a distinct look. So all of the characters are inspired by Japanese clothing or Japanese paintings. And then the animal characters of the film have pretty distinct looks that are necessary to making a visually interesting film. Laika loves to do this thing where they make characters that are absolutely nightmare-inducing, terrifying. They had gotten a lot of buzz in 2005 for Coraline, which I watched when I was probably about 8 or 9, and it scared the hell out of me. It is terrifying, and a lot of that happens to be with their creature designs. And so particularly the eyeballs in the ocean and the skeleton are pretty darn scary. So this film is kid-friendly and it is for children. I hesitate to use that because it is not only for children, but it is pretty scary. So make sure that if you have young kids, you know their boundaries before watching it with them so you don't give them nightmares or scar them. But this film is, a lot of Laika films don't necessarily lend itself to being just a kid's film. They are very mature, whether it be with the creature designs, but particularly for Kubo, it has to do a lot with the story beats and the themes that go on. And so this one in particular deals a lot with loss and endings. So endings is a clear motif that is shown, that is actually said throughout, that every story needs an ending. And so loss is something that permeates throughout this film. It is something that Kubo has to deal with time and time again. And so having a character that can get through loss in an effective way and come out still being caring and loving and meeting every opportunity that he has with love and acceptance is really inspiring to show to young kids, and something that is inspiring for adults to be watching as well. It is a movie about growing up, not necessarily a movie about adolescence, but a movie that is all about the loss of innocence and moving away from your parents. I know that I'm kind of viewing this with a more of a college mentality. So moving away from your parents and learning how to be independent with those around you. And so that's something that is shown throughout the film, and a theme that is pretty necessary to be showing in films at large. So with a lot of my weekly recommendations, it is very difficult to be objective, but those are all of the story, film elements that make the movie so good. But I really connected with this film with all of its themes and morals. The animation is gorgeous. Something that I also found very, very cool that I didn't necessarily know until recently is that Kubo and the Two Strings is a fascinating name as a title of the film, because a shamisen, which is the type of guitar type instrument, it's reminiscent of a guitar or a banjo, from Japan, is what Kubo uses to create his origami sculptures and creatures. But a shamisen traditionally has 3 strings as opposed to 2 strings. But throughout the film, Kubo uses the hair from his mother and the bow string from his father's armor and gear. So those are 2 strings. And he also uses his own hair, which is Kubo. So it's Kubo and the 2 strings, and he is one of the strings. And it shows the elements of family and relationships in understanding your own identity, which I find beautiful. I think it is a wonderful title for a film. So I love this movie. I think it is fantastic. It is my weekly recommendation for animation. It's kind of a mix of Fantastic Mr. Fox and A Whisker Away with the Japanese culture and the stop motion. So I'm going to give this movie a solid 9 out of 10. I highly recommend it. You can watch it. You can stream it for rent on Amazon or any other place that you watch movies. So that's my recommendation. And now we get to talk about the movie industry, which I'm very excited about. But right before we do that, stay tuned. But we're going to take a quick break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Like to make an even larger franchise outside of Jack Sparrow. This is something that had come about after the scandals with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. So Disney had originally detached themselves from Johnny Depp after certain allegations, but given that newer evidence has come to light, Johnny Depp might be back in the picture. Disney hasn't said anything, but this film, regardless, is probably not going to center around Jack Sparrow. It would more consist of him in a cameo-type role. So Margot Robbie seems to be taking a more lead role in Pirates of the Caribbean to create a larger universe-type franchise, something that everybody is obsessed with nowadays. And in fact, there is a character that had been implemented on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride a couple years ago called Red, and a lot of speculation is that Margot Robbie will be playing that character as the lead pirate to keep the franchise going. So there's no major announcement as to what character she'll be playing, but she is definitely attached to Pirates of the Caribbean, and it is definitely interesting to see where that franchise is going. Some more specific movie news. Michael Keaton is back as Batman in a limited sense. So DC, I know that I talked about this with my Birds of Prey review, has been trying and up for interpretation how well they're doing to create this cinematic universe as well. And one of the things that they had wanted to do was create a Flash movie around Ezra Miller, who has since backed out of the role. And it was going to originally be directed by Rick Famuyiga, who directed Dope, and he also backed out of the project. So this Flash movie has been on the ropes for a long time, but apparently it is still happening, and it is supposed to center around the comic storyline of Flashpoint. And for those of you who don't know what the comic storyline of Flashpoint is, it basically centers around Barry Allen, who is the Flash, and he runs so fast back in time that he creates a parallel timeline, a brand new timeline where everything is different. Wonder Woman and Aquaman are at war. Batman is now Bruce Wayne's father, Thomas Wayne, because Bruce Wayne had been murdered as opposed to Thomas and Martha Wayne, where Martha Wayne becomes so distraught at her son's death that she becomes the Joker. So there are some very cool storylines that go on in this. I think it is a very popular comic. It is a comic that I definitely enjoy, and that is something that they were trying to bring onto screen, which had been hinted at in Batman v Superman with one of the Flash's cameos in that film. But if you know anything about the route that DC has taken with their films, it's definitely an interesting movie to put onto screen because of the fact that it follows parallel timelines. You can do a lot of things with the films that DC has been putting out that don't necessarily exist in the same world or the same timeline. Something that had been popularized in comics a long time ago and brought to the forefront in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, that parallel timelines can potentially be done pretty effectively, and now the MCU is moving towards that direction as well. So that's something to be looking out for, not only shared universes, but shared universes with multiple parallel timelines and different versions of the character. But the reason it's fascinating is that because you can have those parallel timelines, Michael Keaton is going to be coming back as Batman and donning the cape and cowl. So in the comic, Thomas Wayne is Batman, who had initially been played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan from the Walking Dead series in Batman v Superman and Justice League. But given that Michael Keaton is now confirmed to be playing the role, I have to speculate that there are going to be different timelines, and the Thomas Martha Wayne is going to be one, given that Jeffrey Dean Morgan is a pretty popular actor as well and would be a very interesting Batman choice. And so Flash might be going to an even different timeline with Michael Keaton. And so that's some minor speculation on my part, but something that seems to that the DC Universe seems to be leading towards for sure. In other specific movie news, the most fascinating news that I have found centers around a new Netflix film called Enola Holmes, starring Millie Bobby Brown from Stranger Things. It is based on a book series that follows Sherlock Holmes' younger sister. The film itself is currently being sued by the Doyle estate. So I find this very fascinating because I'm pretty fascinated in copyright law and copyright in film. So some of you may know this, but copyright and public domain has been at the center of creative pieces for a very long time. Ever since these laws were created, creative properties could go into the public domain after a certain amount of time or after a certain amount of time after the artist's death. That's why we see a lot of iterations of the same stories, Sherlock Holmes being one of them. So any film story adaptation of any creative property from something before the 1920s is probably in the public domain. That's how Disney made a lot of their money in the first place. Most of their stories are Grimm's fairy tales that has been in the public domain for a very long time. So that's something that you don't have to use, or you don't have to pay any money to use those stories and to create new iterations. But the reason I find this fascinating in terms of film is because after Disney made a lot of those movies from the public domain, they lobbied Congress for a very long time, specifically in America, to not let anything go into the public domain. And that has been happening ever since the 1950s for that lobbying, and then that law got extended in the 1990s. And so right now in the United States, things are starting to go into the public domain for the first time, which is fantastic in my mind. I think that is a great storytelling tool. So in the United States, any story created before 1923 is in the public domain, but anything after 1923 is not. There are definitely exceptions to that rule. Certain recordings of songs versus the actual sheet music of certain songs, and there are definitely some books that are still not in copyright given certain artists' recommendations or requests. But most things before 1923 are in the public domain, and Sherlock Holmes is one of them. Almost all of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories are in the public domain. There are about 10 Sherlock Holmes books that were written from 1923 to 1927. So the Doyle estate currently owns those books. And so what I found in doing research on the lawsuit happening right now, so the Enola Holmes books are protected under public domain. So the author can write those books based on Sherlock Holmes in general, but in the Sherlock Holmes books, post-1923, the Doyle estate has argued that the character of Sherlock Holmes is a much more sympathetic and emotional, caring character after the death of some of his relatives in those stories. And so they own the 10 books, and they also own the version of the character that is kinder, more emotional, more caring. And they are making the argument that in the Enola Holmes movie, the Sherlock Holmes character, played by Henry Cavill, is much more caring and charming and more reminiscent of the books that they own. So it's a really fascinating lawsuit. It does seem to me like a way for the Doyle estate to get some more money. It doesn't seem like there is a huge foundation. I don't know all of the evidence in this lawsuit, but I thought it was a very fascinating thing to be sharing, and a cool added context to that movie itself that I'm hopefully going to be reviewing in the future. So now moving on to the film industry. it's definitely hard to know what's going to happen. Movie theaters are still closed. They've been closed for a very long time. They are some of the last businesses to reopen among the restrictions being lifted. And I think that it's hard for a lot of consumers to wrap their head around going into a smaller space for 2 hours with a bunch of strangers breathing the same air. So it's hard to know what the future of the movie industry is going to look like. The one thing that we do know is that movie theaters are going to be opening back up in mid-July for certain as of right now. AMC being the front runner, they are the largest movie theater chain. They have announced that most of their theaters are going to be reopening July 15th, with the rest of their movie theaters opening a week later. They are currently only allowing 30% capacity, which is significantly lower than a lot of other businesses that are opening back up at about 50%. But it is definitely a good thing that they're opening only at 30% capacity. Most other movie theaters are following suit, opening mid-July. So any movie theater that is near you is most likely opening mid-July. The problem with the openings is that not a lot of movies are coming out. So most movie theaters closed at the beginning of the summer blockbuster season. So nowadays, the summer blockbuster season starts at about March. It continuously gets pushed back. It definitely makes its biggest claims in May and June, but there are some early blockbusters that get shown in March. Most notably this year was Mulan, and that got pushed back. So any film that was going to open in theaters has been pushed back. A lot of them were added to streaming services, Trolls World Tour, Scoob, like I said earlier in this episode. But a lot of the movies that had been pushed back are being pushed back even further to later this year or even 2021. So a lot of these movie theaters are opening up, but they don't necessarily have anything to show. The earliest film that I can find is July 24th, and that is Mulan. Christopher Nolan's newest outing, Tenet, has also been pushed back. It had been pushed back from mid-July to July 31st, and it is now at August 12th, so there is no certainty as to when that is getting released. I know that Christopher Nolan is a filmmaker who probably won't want his film to streaming services, because while streaming services are effective in giving a wider audience the film, there are a lot of movies that are made for the theaters and made for a larger spectacle, bigger visuals, larger than life sound, and so there are a lot of films and filmmakers that are reluctant to go straight to streaming. Seeing the success, though, of Trolls World Tour making around $100 million at home, it's hard to know what the future of movie theaters look like. There's definitely going to be an added element of more films coming to streaming services, knowing that they can make that money, or at least coming to rent. I think there is the element of quarantine, that there weren't a lot of new movies coming out, so that might have added to the success of Trolls World Tour, but that is obviously speculative, hard to know. But movie theaters are definitely not going away, at least not soon as far as I can tell, with them opening back up. It's hard to know how long they'll stay open, how long they'll stay at 30% capacity, and what movies will be coming out then. But I would like to do within the next couple weeks a segment on what we can look forward to as far as films go for the rest of the year and major wide releases. So that's a lot of the movie news. Those are some of the movie announcements. I hope that you enjoyed this segment. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you do intend on going to the movies, make sure that you are staying safe and wearing a mask, keeping your distance. I'm going to try my best to go see some of those movies. I'm still trying my best to stay safe and stay inside, but I do know that I want to see some of those movies and I want to review those movies for you. So I will be at some of these theaters reopenings, but staying safe and wearing a mask. So please be safe, be kind. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. And thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.